Hey everybody, it's Booksy. Today is Sunday, December 26th, and this is going to be an update for ATER, ATER, Ethereum. So we're going to talk today just about the fractal. So if you know my work on AMC, you know that I'm pretty good at tracking fractals and giving labels to them, and also kind of identifying like what the major patterns are within a fractal sequence. And the reason why this is important when you're looking at technical analysis in general, just pattern analysis, is that the way that a stock is traded is typically pretty two-dimensional, right? On the surface, right? You have accumulation, you have distribution, you have buying, you have selling. And that's pretty much all it comes down to. And I'm sure that most of you are aware that when you're trying to play a stock, you know, you obviously want to sell when it's high and buy when it's low. And in the case of a lot of these so-called meme stocks, typically the narrative has been to buy and to hold, and that this is how you cause short squeezes to happen. I'm not going to comment on that today. All I'm going to say is that while I do think that there is some validity to those arguments, that the predominant method of trading is always just going to be buy and sell, buy low, sell high. And that's the way that most stocks are traded. And so when you're looking at a fractal sequence, no matter how you want to interpret each individual part, the goal should always be to determine whether you're in an accumulation or a distribution, whether you're gathering more shares by buying or you're starting to distribute by selling in order to push the price down, presumably to do it all over again. So that being said, I did go through and I mapped what I believe is the typical ATER fractal, and I did it on multiple time frames. So if you remember, I did a video not too long ago about this fractal right here in this region where my mouse is pointing to. This is the macro fractal. And so if you were to look at, let me zoom out a little on this one. This is 1 minute, this is 5 minutes. So let's go to the 1 minute here. And if you look at this region, and you were to track this to what we see on the macro, let's look at the daily. All right, you see that this is a repeated pattern on this stock, that you have this push down into what looks like a double bottom, almost, accumulation. Then you get a run up to a distribution point. You get a push down, and there's a couple major push downs here, but this is the most significant one, the one that stood out to me the most, which is this major push down on major volume that acts as sort of a spring. And then after the spring, you have the test, right? And then you continue upward. Now, at this particular point in the fractal pattern, it starts to iterate. And what that means is that essentially it doesn't complete. So it starts this accumulation and distribution and then accumulation, but instead of continuing up to where you would have another distribution, you actually immediately start distributing, not even before it breaks out of this region. And the main reason for that is pretty simple. I don't want to get into it like too much in depth in this video. But the predominant region, that the reason this is happening is because basically you have a segmented fractal that's occurring in this region right here. And we'll get to that in a minute. But the point isn't so much like, hey, why did this start breaking down? Is that what's going to happen here? Certainly, I mean, once we get to that point, yeah, you could say that maybe that's a possibility. But I want you to also take note of a couple other things, which is that these fractals are like lemmings. They follow the macro. So if the macro says, hey, you can't break out here because we got to keep going down to finish a macro version of this, right? Because remember, this is a micro. This is a tiny version. And it's right here. It's embedded in this larger version. What's happening in the larger version is that we're still in this section, okay? We're still heading down. So it doesn't make sense that this would break out of the, this falling wedge here early from this point. But that being said, when it does choose to break out, fractals will use periods of run-ups, this region, to manufacture breakouts. All right, so again, we've already identified that. So it wasn't that big of a stretch for me anyways to just go in and when I started seeing this pattern again, so here it is again, right? Here's the lower accumulation, you got the run up, you got the distribution happening up top here, you get the push down. We got a very similar looking push down, right, into a wedge, but when it broke out again, it started doing the same thing again. And it did it twice, and I thought, well, if this is an iteration, then that means that they're storing up something. Right? They only do this when they want to drive the price as low as it can possibly go before they decide they're going to make a move. And it's somewhat of a way of kind of biding time. But then the other thing that you need to take note of is that there's other motives here. Remember when we were looking at just a minute ago, it was in that falling wedge. It didn't break up, right? So it didn't continue. It just starts iterating again. Well, what's going on right now in the macro is that we're getting that gator snap pattern, as I call it, which is the double U. And this is filling out the second U. So while you're looking at the fractal sequence, and you're seeing like, okay, I'm seeing the accumulation, the distribution, the reaccumulation, but then doesn't continue up, it just starts over again. It's important to note that it's not going to just start running straight up, right, and break this macro pattern. That's just not how it works. So as you watch fractal sequences, you have to put them in context, and certainly on the micro, the context is always going to be the macro. So I'm going to show you a few different time frames. I'm just going to walk you through it. What I see, what I would see then as we work back out towards the macro, and that'll be the conclusion of the video today. So basically on all of these stocks, you have the same sort of patterning at the bottom where you have this M shape. Sometimes it's a little stretched out, like is the case here. Very stretched out, very awkward looking. But that is the shape. Other times it's much more obvious. Right? It looks like a straight up letter M. And then sometimes it's at a slight angle. So it really depends on the region that comes right before, which is I'm calling it E for now, just to help me track it, which is sort of the second major step down. All right. So if we start at A, the M, then B is a run up that basically has two major pushes. All right, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You see this? And in this case, 1, 2, and the 2 is quite short. But it's also possible that this is actually 1 right here. This is all part of 2, this region right here. Some of the things that makes fractal tracking really difficult is that you can have these really exaggerated moves in the midst of what normally is a more tame move. And you kind of have to take things with a grain of salt. When you see those things, you really need to look at the big picture and just say, okay, what happens between B and C, and did that happen here? And it could have, like this could be B, the end of B right here. But one thing I noticed is that C sets up a particular way, and I'm not sure I'm seeing that right here. So at least at this point, B is, in my opinion, this region until we see what happens on Monday. So after B, you have C, and C is the distribution. It's the main distribution. It starts everything off. You'll note that B and D, they form little peaks on either side of C usually. You see this? So there's one on B, D, there's the C. Right here, B, D, and then there's the C. And the C looks like a bit like a double top. And all together, you end up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And all of these could be considered like the stages of distribution here. If we were looking at this in terms of like a Wyckoff pattern, you could probably pretty easily identify those stages if you blocked it off. 1, 2, 3, 4. E is the next part of the sequence, and E is usually some kind of a sharp. Well, first of all, I should talk about D. D is a really unique one. D always includes this very harsh drop, and sometimes it's not as obvious. In this case, the motion was all downward, so the interpretation of these fractals doesn't look quite the same. But when it leveled off, they are very, very similar. The D always has this very sharp drop, and it almost includes like a V shape. You see this pointed V, this like pointed V here, and this pointed V here, right? And then it includes, I'm sorry, here, and then it includes this really harsh drop. So it almost comes up and forms a little pillar and then drops. E is sort of the next phase, and that's really just a catch and a walk down. And the walk down can be kind of long and sideways. It typically is just kind of leading you into A. In some of these cases, this walk down, it's not as clear whether this is actually all part of E or if this is more or less all A. You could easily say, well, I think this is the M right here, and I would believe it. I don't really think there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. What I looked at specifically was that right here there was a turning point, and so if E can go sideways and curve upward, if that's how we defined E, then we could say that E goes this direction. But everywhere else that I saw E, it does sometimes have this mound at the very start of it, which you can see here. There's a mound there. But then after the mound, it just sells off. It doesn't ever change direction completely again. It does, again, ramp into A, but that's the reason why I drew it the way I drew it over here. And I'm looking at this as this up, down, maybe up to there, all right? And then we start back again at B, okay? I'm not gonna go into like high detail of each of these sections just yet. I just wanted to illustrate like why I think each section is the way that it is, like just to show you what they look like. And we'll talk about more of the why later as we go into this a little bit more. But I'm gonna go ahead and now look at a couple of different ones. So let's look at midterm B. So midterm is the way that I describe a stock's longer fractals. So keep in mind, we just looked at this region right here. All right, that's this region, right in this region. We just looked at the base of the bowl, and we saw all these microfractals, right? It repeated 1, 2, 3 times right in this region. Now we're zooming out, and we're looking at a larger region. And this is the way that fractals work, is that they nest inside themselves. So the micros were serving the macros, and that's why you see what you see. And at least for this one, I'm going to leave this on so we can kind of compare. All right. Okay, let's look at this main sequence right here. Just use this as a guide. So we start with the M shape. You can see it here. We get the 1, 2 push, 1, 2 push. There's a little bit of a sell-off, and then it propels us into the C, 1, 2 right there. And then here's the other one. Again, grain of salt. You could look at this more and say this to you looks more like E. I was specifically looking for this marker, and it could be here. You could make that argument, and if that's the case, then again, you would have to say that this is all part of C. But one thing I noticed is that if you look carefully, you see how B has this plateau and then it drops. It does that in a couple different places where it seems to have like a second drop. And I'm seeing this as the plateau right here and then the drop. So I'm pretty sure that this is C altogether, this region. And then you get this cell, see? And then you get a spike. It's like a final liquidity spike. It doesn't work, and then it sells off hard. You get a little bit of a bounce, right, into E. E is just another sell-off that leads you into the next M. M stays pretty elevated. The thing about M is that in anywhere you see it, the middle portion of the M doesn't come all the way back down. It sort of stays elevated. So this fits the bill. And then basically we move into a B. At this point, it's not clear to me whether or not this is like a completed B. You see here how this has a push up and then a flatten area. That's the way that I'm interpreting this right now. It's push up, flattened area. Looks very similar to this, and then a run up. But that being said, it would be silly to think that it has to be it. That has to be what it is. Again, until we see it fill out a little more, I'm not certain about that move. Let's look at one more. Well, we'll look at two more time frames here. All right, so this is a longer time frame. I'm going to go to the 15-minute. So this is another midterm time frame. This one I called midterm A. Again, I'm going to leave this chart up for now so you can see it. And we'll take a look. Yeah, let me get rid of this. All right, so this one's kind of tricky because you should, at least at this point, if you're in the stock, you know this region very well. This is when the major buy-in happened. The OBV went crazy. I'm going to go to 30 minutes. So you can just see it all. At first, I wasn't really sure whether or not we could consider this entire thing the M, or if this whole part right here should be considered part of the M. But again, I believe the M is predominantly the bottom of the move, and it does sometimes seem to appear perhaps on the side of a move, but the way that I'm interpreting this is that you do have an M here, and I don't think it's something that we should like overcomplicate in this case. If you look at the patterns, you can see that the major pushdown does match this shape coming off the M. You see that? So that's why I'm fairly certain that this is the M right here. It's just very ugly and not easy to read. But there are two pretty large push-ups in this section. The rest of it actually reads really well. So the M is one that I'm not certain about, but the rest of it looks really good. And that is, you know, we go into the purple region. You have a push-up, right? 1, 2. There's always a 2-part push-up. 1, 2. This emulates that gator snap, the W pattern, right? That we see. Then you've got the C stage, which is another push, but it's not as strong typically, or it's sort of like the volume is being kind of tested to the max, and that's when you start getting the major sells. So again, you know, even if we were to push this back and say it was like this, I don't really think it makes a huge difference. We're talking about just like a distributive phase, and certainly that's what this is. And then we've got the push up in D. This is like kind of the final push. You can see it right here, right? Looks pretty one-to-one to me. And then you've got a major sell. And I don't know if you remember this, but this is where we were at like I think the 786 or something, and it just dropped straight through. It was hard to sell. You get a bit of a catch and a mound here with E. And then E walks you down to the bottom where you start your M. And at this point, you could make one of two cases. I believe you could say that E was pretty short, and that this right here is the first part of the M. And there are some fractals here where the M sort of steps down. And that's a possibility. I think you could make that case. I'm not going to argue one way or another right now because I really want to see this next stage. But regardless of whether or not this is the M or not, we would expect to see one more move up and down. One more move up and down. That's always how the M finishes. So when we move up and down, which is going to define like the upward movement. So based on where we are in the fractal with where I think we are in the snap pattern on the W, my thought is that this is possibly like already finished, but like the M, but it's going to depend on like what we see with this move right here. If this move breaks below, then I would definitely have to say like I think the M is not over. But if it continues to move up, then yes, we would say okay, like clearly this was the first part of the M, second part of the M. All right, and then this is the beginning of B. Now you can see that yes, I drew B up pretty high because B typically extends at least to E. You can see that. Sometimes it goes well beyond. It depends on what the upward momentum is. And in a downtrend, your B is going to be a lot weaker typically than if you're in an actual uptrend. So do I think that it has to come all the way up to $20 on this particular iteration? No. I think, if you're looking at conservative numbers, we're talking about probably $8 at least. And then between 8 and 10 is really this hot pocket region that I think it needs to break in order to really confirm an uptrend. All right, one more. Okay, and then I've got the macro. So the macro is very, to me anyways, is probably the most interesting because I'll bring the other back in a minute, but I just wanted to show you, how well this has, how well this is tracked. Before this point, I'm not super concerned about it. I think that more than likely, you can see that this would be E right here. And then perhaps this is D. And then it really starts with a distribution here. Or maybe there was a short accumulation period. And I think it happened pretty rapidly in the beginning. But let's just look at this for just a second. And remember, we start with that M. And here it is, very ugly. But that's definitely the M. Here, let me go back to this comparison so you can see. Right. And again, the M and B kind of they share points. So it's not super important that we define it perfectly. It's more important that we just kind of recognize that it's there. Okay. And then when we propel out, you get a 1, 2. Now, on this particular B, the 1, 2 is very exaggerated. And again, it depends on where you stop B. I think I was drawing B wherever it kind of falls out. And then there's a connector to C. You see how I stopped it here, and then there's a little connector to C. So this is the way that I view it, is like a 1 and then a 2. You could always draw it like all the way up to the top and say this is all part of B and that this is like the 1 and then 2. But to avoid confusion and just keep it simple for myself, I kept it based on what I could recognize and not on regions that I wasn't sure about. This to me, if you look at this one, definitely looks like it's all part of B, right? But then you don't have a C, and that doesn't really make sense. So I think C was pretty abbreviated. I think it was very quick. You do get this sort of push up into a dome shape here, which is what we got. And then you usually get some sideways action. And in this case, it's a sign of weakness, right? So you see this like shape here. You get a last little push up. It doesn't work. And then it starts selling off. D. In this case, again, I think there's a couple different ways you can look at this. You can look at this as this right here is part of D. this push and then big drop. The reason I looked at this as part of D is because of volume here. You see how it breaks through that trend that was going, and that's what happens in D. It breaks below that trend typically. It kind of pushes the limits of the trend. And so if that's D, then this would be your E, right? This mound shape, and then the major sell. And that does make sense when you look at a comparison. But if that's the case, then after E, then you're going to have a very large A. And there's not really, unless this is all part of M here, and it could be, I mean, you see it in some regards here. I think that's a possibility. Then it is also possible that, yeah, there's another push up, down, up. I've not really defined it that well yet. I need to really take some time and map these regions. The other option is that this is actually E over here, and that this section, this is an elongated C right here, and that really, when we're looking at D, as I call it, it's this whole region. Okay, this push up, and then a major drop, and then E is sort of the recovery. Again, I think there's reason to think that's not the case, because most of the time that drop on E does not come below the base of E, in which case this one did. So again, a couple different interpretations of it, and I haven't narrowed it down perfectly, but I don't think it matters too much, because whether we're in the A period here, where we're still going to see like another part of the M, or if we just started A and we're going to see a push up to 8, you know, a little sell off, another push up, sell off. There's other things that sort of we can use in later like analysis to help us narrow it down more. But my main point here is that I think we are coming to a place where we are on that bottom distribution range. We're in this region, no matter how you chart it. And so what we're really looking at is we're looking at a move back to the upside, which is what makes the most sense according to Wyckoff and everything else anyways. So anyways, that's all I've got for right now. I'm going to continue working on this, and I'm going to narrow it down. This is an introductory video. It's not meant to be the forever gospel truth on this. Probably this chart right here, this macro chart, is going to change a little bit. So take it with a grain of salt, and just recognize that this is the region that we clearly are in. It's just a matter of like what part of it, you know, needs to be defined still, and not quite like making a definitive answer on that just yet. But I think we'll get it pretty soon. You know, the stock will move with or without my analysis. So whether I figure it out in time or not, it's going to move. So right now, I just wanted to kind of walk you through it, let you see what I'm working on. And yeah, I hope you all have a good one.